One of the deepest reasons avoidants eventually miss the empath they once rejected is because the empath was often the one person who truly saw them. And that kind of experience is rare for someone who has spent most of their life hiding behind emotional armor. Avoidant individuals are not usually cold by nature. What they are, more often than not, is guarded. Somewhere in their past, whether through disappointment, betrayal, or emotional neglect, they learned that vulnerability carries risk. And so they developed a strategy for survival. Keep distance, stay in control, reveal only what feels safe. Over time, this strategy becomes part of their identity. They become the independent one, the self-reliant one, the one who doesn't need too much from anyone. On the surface, it can look like strength, and in many ways, it is. But underneath that strength is often a quiet fear. The fear that if someone truly saw the whole picture, they might not stay. Most people never get close enough to challenge that belief. Friends may see the confident exterior. Partners may see fragments of emotion. But very few people take the time to understand the deeper layers. And this is where the empath enters the story. Empaths have an unusual ability to notice what others overlook. They don't just listen to words. They read energy, tone, silence, hesitation. They sense the emotion behind the mask. Where others might see distance, the empath sees protection. Where others might see indifference, the empath recognizes fear. Without even trying, the empath begins to understand the avoidant in a way that most people never have. And at first, that can feel incredibly comforting. For the avoidant, being around someone who doesn't demand explanations, who doesn't force emotional exposure, who simply accepts them as they are, it creates a rare sense of safety. The empath's patience allows the avoidant to relax their guard, sometimes for the first time in a long time. But here's where the paradox begins, because the deeper the empath understands them, the more visible the avoidant feels. And visibility can feel dangerous to someone who has spent years protecting their inner world. Being truly seen is powerful. It means someone recognizes not just your strengths, but your fears, your insecurities, your contradictions. For someone comfortable with vulnerability, that experience can feel liberating. For an avoidant, it can feel terrifying. Suddenly, the emotional distance that once felt safe begins to collapse. The connection becomes real, intimate, unavoidable. And for someone whose instincts are built around maintaining space, the natural reaction is to pull away. So they retreat. They rationalize. Sometimes, they convince themselves the relationship is too intense, too complicated, or simply not right. And in that moment, rejecting the empath feels like regaining control. But time has a way of revealing what emotion hides. When the empath is gone, the avoidant eventually encounters a different kind of silence. The new people they meet may be kind, interesting, even compatible, but something feels missing. Conversations feel more surface level. Connections feel less intuitive, because what they experienced with the empath wasn't just affection, it was recognition. Someone once looked beyond the defenses and saw the person underneath and accepted them without trying to change them. And once you've been truly seen like that, even briefly, it becomes very difficult to forget. That realization doesn't always arrive quickly. Avoidants process emotions slowly, often long after the moment has passed. But when the understanding finally settles in, it carries a quiet weight, because they begin to recognize that the person they pushed away wasn't someone who misunderstood them. It was the rare person who understood them completely. And once you understand that the empath was able to see them on a deeper level, the next piece of the puzzle begins to make sense. Because what happens after that recognition is something many people misinterpret. Avoidants often reject the very love that could have meant the most to them, not because the connection lacked value, but because it carried too much emotional weight. For someone who has built their life around emotional independence, deep connection can feel unfamiliar. It disrupts the system they've carefully constructed to stay safe. The avoidant mind is constantly working to maintain stability, distance, control, predictability. Those things create a sense of order. But when an empath enters the picture, that system gets challenged. Empaths connect deeply and naturally. They don't operate on the surface level for long. They ask meaningful questions. They pay attention to emotional shifts. They create moments of closeness that invite authenticity. And while that kind of connection can feel beautiful, it can also feel overwhelming for someone who is not used to it. At first, the avoidant may enjoy the warmth. It can feel refreshing to be around someone who brings emotional energy, someone who listens, someone who cares without conditions. But as the relationship grows deeper, something else begins to happen internally. The closeness starts to activate their internal alarm system. This is not always a conscious decision. In many cases, the avoidant isn't sitting there thinking, this person loves me too much, I should leave. It's more subtle than that. What they feel is pressure, intensity, or a loss of personal space. The relationship begins to feel emotionally demanding, even if the empath isn't demanding anything at all. Why does that happen? Because deep connection requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is the very thing avoidants learn to avoid. To open up emotionally means allowing someone access to parts of yourself that you've worked hard to protect. It means risking disappointment, rejection, or dependency. And for someone whose survival strategy has always been self-reliance, that risk can feel enormous. So when the relationship becomes real, when emotions deepen, when attachment forms, the avoidant often experiences an internal conflict. Part of them feels drawn to the connection. They appreciate the empathy, the warmth, the sense of being understood. But another part of them feels exposed, and exposure triggers retreat. This is why, from the outside, the avoidant's behavior can look confusing. One moment, they appear engaged and present. The next moment, they seem distant, distracted, or emotionally unavailable. What's actually happening is a push and pull between connection and self-protection. The more meaningful the relationship becomes, the more their protective instincts activate. Not because the empath did something wrong, but because the relationship reached a level of emotional depth they were not prepared to handle. So they step back. Sometimes it comes in the form of subtle distancing, less communication, fewer emotional conversations. Other times it appears more abruptly through criticism, detachment, or even ending the relationship entirely. To the empath, this often feels painful and confusing. How can someone walk away from a connection that felt so real? But from the avoidance perspective, walking away restores the one thing they believe they need most: emotional control. Distance quiets the intensity. Independence returns. The pressure disappears. For a while, that distance can feel like relief. But relief is not the same as fulfillment, because what they pushed away wasn't just emotional intensity. It was genuine closeness, the kind that challenges people to grow beyond their fears. And eventually, when the emotional storm settles and reflection begins, many avoidants realize something profound. The love they rejected wasn't the problem. It was the mirror it held up to their own fear of being truly known. And that realization leads to a truth that often arrives later than expected. Sometimes the love that feels overwhelming is not the love that's wrong. It's the love that asks you to become braver than you've ever been before. And after that retreat happens, after the distance is created and the relationship ends, something very interesting begins to unfold. Because what many people misunderstand about avoidance is this: they are extremely skilled at creating emotional space, but they are not immune to the consequences of that space. In fact, the silence that follows an empath's departure often hits them in ways they never expected. When the relationship first ends, the avoidant may feel a sense of relief. The emotional intensity is gone. The pressure to respond, to open up, to navigate deep feelings, suddenly it disappears. Their world returns to something familiar: independence, quiet, control over their emotional environment. And in the beginning, that can feel comfortable, but comfort is not the same thing as connection. Because while the empath may have brought emotional depth, they also brought something else that the avoidant didn't fully appreciate in the moment: warmth. The kind of warmth that quietly fills the space between two people. Empaths have a way of making environments feel emotionally alive. Through small gestures, attentive listening, thoughtful questions, and genuine care, they create a relational atmosphere where another person feels supported, even when nothing dramatic is happening. Often avoidants don't recognize how much that emotional presence mattered until it's gone. At first, life continues normally. Work continues. Social circles remain. Daily routines carry on. But gradually, something subtle begins to shift. The conversations feel different. Interactions that once felt engaging now feel more surface level. People may be friendly, even interesting, but the emotional depth that once existed is missing. There's less patience in others, less intuitive understanding, less emotional safety. And the avoidant starts noticing something they didn't expect: a quiet emptiness, not dramatic loneliness. Avoidants are very capable of being alone. What they feel is more nuanced than that. It's the absence of a particular kind of emotional presence, the presence that the empath brought into their life without asking for recognition. They begin to notice the small things: the way the empath used to listen carefully when they spoke, the way they remembered details that others overlooked, the calm patience they offered when the avoidant needed space, the quiet encouragement they gave without demanding change. Those moments often felt ordinary at the time, but in hindsight, they begin to carry weight. Because the avoidant starts to realize that what the empath provided was not just affection, it was emotional stability, a consistent, understanding presence that asked very little in return. And once that presence disappears, the silence takes on a different meaning. It's no longer just quiet, it's absence. Avoidants may not process this realization immediately. Their emotional processing tends to move slowly, sometimes unfolding months or even years later. But human psychology has a remarkable way of revisiting experiences that were once dismissed too quickly. Memories return. Not always the dramatic moments, but the subtle ones, the conversations, the laughter, the feeling of being understood without needing to explain everything. And with that reflection comes a new awareness. The empath wasn't simply someone who loved them, they were someone who brought emotional richness into their life. Someone who made connection feel deeper, more meaningful, more alive. Without that presence, other interactions begin to feel incomplete. This is the moment when the silence truly lands, because it forces the avoidant to confront something they rarely allow themselves to examine: the cost of emotional distance. Distance protects you from vulnerability. It protects you from risk, but it also protects you from the very experiences that give relationships meaning. And when someone who once filled your world with quiet understanding is no longer there, the silence begins to speak louder than any conversation ever did. It whispers a simple but powerful truth. The space you created to protect yourself may also be the very space where the person who cared about you most used to stand. And once that silence begins to settle in, another psychological process quietly starts to unfold. Human beings naturally evaluate their experiences through comparison. We don't always realize we're doing it, but the mind constantly measures the present against the past. For avoidants, this comparison often begins long after the relationship with the empath has ended. Initially, many avoidants try to move forward quickly. Independence has always been their comfort zone, so they return to familiar territory, focusing on work, routines, friendships, and sometimes even new romantic connections. On the surface, it may appear as though they've moved on effortlessly, but internally, something subtle is happening. Every new interaction becomes an unconscious point of reference. Every new person they meet, every new conversation, every new attempt at connection quietly gets measured against the emotional experience they once had. And what they often discover is that something feels different. The new relationships might be pleasant, even exciting in the beginning. There might be attraction, shared interests, enjoyable conversations, but the emotional rhythm is not the same. The depth is not the same. With the empath, connection had a certain natural flow. Conversations moved easily between ideas, emotions, and personal experiences. There was a level of understanding that didn't require constant explanation. The empath could sense things before they were fully spoken. That kind of emotional attunement is rare, and when it's gone, the absence becomes noticeable. Avoidants may begin to encounter partners who operate more on the surface level. Conversations stay practical, light, or casual. Emotional discussions feel uncomfortable or short-lived. There may be chemistry, but there is less emotional resonance. At first, this difference might not seem significant. In fact, part of the avoidant may even appreciate the simplicity. Less emotional intensity can feel easier to manage, but over time, ease can start to feel like emptiness. Because what the empath created wasn't just closeness, it was meaning. They had the ability to make ordinary moments feel emotionally rich. A simple conversation could turn into a deep reflection about life, growth, fears, or dreams. Empaths naturally invite depth into relationships, not by force, but through curiosity and emotional awareness. When that dynamic disappears, interactions can start to feel predictable, safe perhaps, but less fulfilling. And slowly, the avoidant begins to notice something they didn't expect. They are comparing, not intentionally, not consciously at first. But the mind remembers emotional experiences that were impactful. They remember how the empath listened without interrupting, how they created space for honesty, how they seemed genuinely interested in understanding the avoidant's inner world. New partners may offer many good qualities, but replicating that level of emotional presence is not easy. Because empathy, patience, and deep attentiveness are not traits that appear in every relationship. This realization can create an uncomfortable awareness. The avoidant starts recognizing that what they once had was different. It wasn't just another relationship. It carried a depth that many connections never reach. And with that recognition comes reflection. They begin replaying moments from the past, conversations they once brushed aside, acts of kindness they once took for granted, emotional support they once viewed as ordinary. But now those memories appear in a new light, because hindsight has a way of revealing value that wasn't fully appreciated in the moment. What once felt like emotional intensity now looks like emotional intelligence. What once felt overwhelming now appears meaningful. And the avoidant slowly begins to understand something profound. The empath didn't just offer love. They offered a level of emotional depth that most people spend years searching for. And once you've experienced that kind of connection, even briefly, it becomes very difficult to settle for something that feels less alive, which leads to a realization that many avoidants eventually face. You can move forward, you can meet new people, you can create new experiences, but some connections leave an imprint so unique that every relationship afterward quietly echoes the same question. Will anyone ever understand me the way they did? And as this process of comparison unfolds, another moment often arrives that many avoidants never anticipated. It's the moment when they begin to notice that the empath they once rejected is no longer waiting. This shift can be subtle at first. Maybe they hear through mutual friends that the empath is doing well. Maybe they see glimpses through social media, or perhaps enough time simply passes that the emotional energy they once felt from that person is no longer directed toward them. But the message becomes clear. The empath has moved forward. For a long time, avoidants unconsciously rely on a quiet assumption. They believe that the empath will always care, not necessarily in a manipulative sense, but because that's what empaths tend to do. They give deeply. They remain patient. They try to understand even when things fall apart. So even after the relationship ends, part of the avoidant's mind may assume that the emotional door remains slightly open. But healing changes people. Empaths, despite their deep compassion, eventually reach a point where they reclaim their own energy. They stop trying to fix what they cannot fix. They stop waiting for someone who cannot meet them halfway. And when they truly move on, they don't just leave physically, they withdraw the emotional presence they once offered so freely. This is the moment that often surprises the avoidant. Because when the empath stops reaching out, stops checking in, stops offering that quiet emotional safety, something shifts in the psychological dynamic. The avoidant suddenly encounters a reality they weren't prepared for. The person who once invested so much emotional energy in them has chosen themselves instead. And that realization can be powerful. It forces the avoidant to see the empath in a different light, not as someone who was overly emotional, overly available, or overly intense, but as someone who had the strength to walk away when their love was no longer valued. Strength changes perception. When the empath was present and patient, the avoidant may have unconsciously perceived that patience as permanence. But when the empath leaves and begins building a life beyond the relationship, their value becomes much more visible. The avoidant begins to see the growth. They notice the confidence the empath develops, the independence they demonstrate, the way they invest in their own well-being, their goals, their happiness. The emotional energy that was once directed toward the avoidant is now being directed toward a fuller life. And suddenly, the narrative shifts. The avoidant realizes that the person they once assumed would always be there is not standing still anymore. This realization can trigger something deeper than simple nostalgia. It can trigger reflection. Because the avoidant begins to question their earlier assumptions. They start reconsidering the way they interpreted the empath's love. What once looked like emotional intensity now appears as emotional strength. What once felt overwhelming now looks like rare dedication. They start to understand that the empath's willingness to care deeply wasn't weakness, it was courage. And when courage walks away, it leaves a powerful impression. The avoidant may begin replaying the past, examining their own reactions, their own fears, their own decision to create distance. They begin recognizing that the person they pushed away wasn't someone who lacked value. It was someone who knew their value well enough to eventually stop giving it where it wasn't received. This is one of the most transformative realizations an avoidant can have, because it challenges the belief that connection will always remain available. It introduces the idea that some people only appear in your life once. And when they leave, the opportunity they represented leaves with them. And that realization carries a quiet but undeniable truth. When someone who once gave you their whole heart finds the strength to walk away and grow beyond you, it forces you to confront a difficult question, not whether they were strong enough to stay, but whether you were brave enough to keep them. As we step back and look at the entire journey we've explored, a powerful pattern begins to emerge. The story of the avoidant and the empath is not simply about two people who didn't work out. It is a story about timing, fear, emotional awareness, and the human struggle between protection and connection. Avoidants don't usually reject people because they feel nothing. In many cases, they reject the very people who make them feel the most. The empath enters their life and does something few others ever do. They see past the surface. They recognize the guarded heart behind the independence, the quiet fears behind the strength, and the humanity behind the emotional distance. For a moment, something rare happens. The avoidant experiences what it feels like to be understood without needing to perform, explain, or defend themselves. But that level of emotional visibility can also feel dangerous. So when the connection deepens, the instinct to protect themselves takes over. Distance feels safer than vulnerability. Control feels safer than intimacy. And in that moment, walking away can feel like the right decision. At first, it even feels like relief. The emotional intensity disappears. Life becomes quieter, simpler, more predictable. The avoidant returns to the independence they've always relied on. But time has a way of revealing what fear once concealed. The silence after the empath leaves begins to feel different. The emotional warmth that once filled the relationship is gone. Conversations with others feel lighter, but also less meaningful. New connections may appear, but something about them feels incomplete. Slowly, almost quietly, the mind begins comparing. They remember the patience, the understanding, the way the empath seemed to recognize their emotions even when they struggled to express them. They begin to realize that what they once dismissed as too much was actually something incredibly rare. And then another realization arrives. The empath is no longer waiting. The person who once offered unconditional understanding has moved forward. They've grown stronger, built a life, redirected their love toward themselves and the future. The emotional door that once stood open has gently closed. And that is when reflection often begins. Because the avoidant is finally able to see the relationship without the pressure that once overwhelmed them. They begin to understand that the empath wasn't asking them to become someone else. They were simply inviting them to be more honest, more open, more present. The connection wasn't the threat. The fear of vulnerability was. And for many avoidants, this realization arrives later than they expect. Sometimes long after the moment when the relationship could have been saved. But the deeper lesson here is not just about regret. It's about awareness. Because every meaningful relationship in life offers us a mirror. Some mirrors reflect our strengths. Others reveal the fears we've been avoiding for years. The empath often becomes that mirror for the avoidant, showing them the parts of themselves they've kept hidden from the world. And when that mirror disappears, the lesson remains. The truth is, deep connection requires courage. It requires the willingness to step beyond emotional defenses and allow another human being to truly know you. Many people spend years protecting themselves from pain, only to realize that in doing so, they also protected themselves from the very love that could have changed their lives. So if there's one final idea to leave you with tonight, it's this. The people who challenge your emotional walls are not always your enemies. Sometimes they are the rare souls who are brave enough to see the real you. And the greatest tragedy in relationships is not losing someone who never cared. It's realizing too late that the person you pushed away was the one who actually did.